Well, as a pastor, one of the most privileged things that I get to do, one of the most holy things that I get to do, is come alongside people who are going through trials or who are suffering. And here's what I've learned not to say to people in those particular times. I've learned not to say, this is probably something God is doing to you to try and test your faith. This is something that God will use to strengthen your faith. Or maybe to put it in these terms, this phrase seems to be a lot more popular. Don't worry, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. I've learned not to say those things because that's not who I believe God is. That's not the God that I read about in scriptures, a God of love who wouldn't test people just for the sake of testing them. Now, on the other hand, I have also learned not to disagree with people when they say things like, Pastor, I would never have asked for this. I wouldn't want to do it again. I wouldn't wish anybody else to go through this, but somehow, some way, in the midst of it all, I have felt God's presence. Somehow, some way, this experience has helped me to grow closer to God and strengthen my faith. Can you see the difference between the two? On one hand is the age-old question. You know the age-old question, Rabbi Kirshner, that was his name, wrote about it when he wrote the book, Why Good Things or Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's that question of suffering and why is there suffering? And the answer is very, very complicated. And to a certain extent, there is a deep mystery about it. Even Jesus himself said, the sun shines on the good and the evil, and it rains on the just and the unjust alike. And so that's not the question of faith for today. The question of faith is, if that is the human condition, if all of us, the unjust and the just alike, if the good and the evil have to go through trials and have to suffer, is it possible that somehow, some way, in the midst of that, we can still have peace? We can increase our capacity for joy. We can even somehow, some way, grow in our faith as the result. Now, the great biblical example of this that was lifted up by John Ortberg in our Lenten Read, which I'm going to say the title again because I just like saying it. If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. The example, the great biblical example that is lifted up is the story of Joseph. Joseph in the Old Testament. That story that takes up so much of the end of the book of Genesis. The story of Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, who has such a huge and massive story. And yet the one image that I get from reading that story is the image that comes near the end, where Joseph is standing there. He is now the most powerful, or second most powerful man in the kingdom of Egypt. And there his 11 brothers, the ones who sold him into slavery and beat him up, are kneeling before him. They don't recognize who he is, but they're kneeling before him and they're completely vulnerable. He can do anything he wants to them, and so this is his moment of vindication. This is the time where he can get revenge without any consequences for all of the suffering that they caused him, for the prison term, for being expelled from his younger brother and his father. This is the time where he can get his revenge, and yet that is not what Joseph does. Instead, it's summed all up by what Joseph says in chapter 50, verse 20 of the book of Genesis. He says, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. How could that happen? Somehow, some way, Joseph was able, in the midst of all his suffering, to not become more angry. Somehow, some way, he was able to know that God was with him the whole time, each and every step of the way, which is why he could move on to the next step, trusting that God was with him. And for this, he had a gritty and a resilient faith. I love that word that's used a few times in our book, resilient faith. Joseph had a resilient faith, one that would take a few lumps, and yet he could still have it. And for that reason, Joseph became a great hero and was able to be used by God to, as Joseph himself said, help save a whole people, the people of Israel. Now, do you know anybody like that? Anybody who's got a resilient faith, a gritty faith? Think about it. My guess is you probably do. My guess is you might even know that they're sitting around you in the pews as we speak. You might even be one of those people. I think of people like Bruce Quick. Do you recognize the name? You maybe never have met him, but we pray for him almost every Sunday. You know why? He needs our prayers. In the past several years, he has gone through 3 major transplant surgeries. He's received a new heart, a new kidney, and a new liver. And yet I talked to him last week, and he still is just this gentle, wonderful, peaceful, joyful individual. I think of his wife, who's also Shelley, who's also had to go through that all with him. I can't count the number of times when I went to go visit and pray with Bruce at the hospital, there was Shelley. I think of people like Phil Schmitz, who was on a vacation, and he doesn't get a lot of those things. And he injured his back, and it's caused some paralysis, but even worse, it's caused chronic pain. And yet last Thursday, he was mentioning that somehow, some way, he has never felt closer to Jesus. I think of some friends of mine whose name I won't mention, but who are members of this church, who went through the worst kind of tragedy. Their 3-year-old son died of a mitochondrial disease. And they are still suffering, even though this happened 14 years ago. They're still grieving, and yet somehow, some way, in the midst of it, this experience didn't make them cynical. It made them softer. It made them graceful, even to the point where they created a foundation that will now help other people who are going through the same problems. This is resilient, gritty faith. Now, it doesn't always happen this way, does it? In fact, sometimes, maybe I would even say most of the time, the storms and the wind, to use the imagery of our book, are the things that actually, instead of making us stronger, they blow us over. They knock us down. They make us harder and more cynical. I thought it was interesting that Ortberg pointed out in chapter 6 how these are the times when we are facing our fears and when we are going through trials. These are the times when we become most vulnerable to temptation. And in my experience, it's true. This is what he says on page 106. He says, I know that I am never more subject to temptation than in those times when life does not turn out the way I planned it. And then he goes on to describe an interesting definition of sin, which I think resonates. He says, sin, to paraphrase what psychologist Carl Jung once said about neurosis, sin is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. It is an attempt to obtain the pleasure that does not rightfully belong to us or evade the pain that does. And so the question, in that experience of being taken down, of being pulled into temptation, the question is, how can we develop that resilient kind of faith, that gritty kind of faith? I think that's an important question to ask, and I love the fact that Ortberg in this book points to the studies that have been done by psychologists on various groups, like people who have survived the concentration camps or POWs, prisoners of war. What they found is people who are gritty, people who have a resilient faith, tend to possess three characteristics. The first one is this: these people are able somehow to control, to hold on to control of their life, even in the midst of the chaotic situations that are around them. This makes me think about one of my favorite all-time movies. Maybe you've seen it, The Shawshank Redemption. Have you seen that movie? If you haven't, it's the story about people who I'm getting my favorite look from Ed quote right here. I like that. Thank you, Ed. That's why I always look at you when I preach. I need that little thing back there. The Shawshank Redemption is the story of people who are thrown in prison. Some of them are thrown in for life, and the great tension for them in the midst of prison is to fight against getting institutionalized. That's the phrase they use for succumbing to the culture in prison, succumbing to the way things work in prison, so much so that you become afraid to get out and be free, afraid of freedom. So they had to try to control themselves in the midst of that tension. Well, that's the first characteristic. The second characteristic is these people who are able to survive and be gritty and have a resilient faith are able to be committed to their own values. How many of us are parents in here? If you're not, that's okay. But isn't one of your main jobs to teach values to your kids? Especially in the midst of all of the pressure that they get. I think of peer pressure.